There are currents beneath culture, hidden patterns, symbols, and ideas that never quite show themselves on the surface. Art, myth, music, and rebellion, all shaped by forces most people never notice, where magic and creativity blur, where artists become channels, and where counterculture is never just coincidence. Let's explore the unseen forces that drive culture forward here on Things Visible and Invisible. Carl Abrahamsson is a Swedish writer, publisher, filmmaker, photographer, and musician. He is best known for his work on Occulture, the intersection of occult ideas and contemporary culture, especially in art, music, and countercultural movements. He is the editor of the journal The Fenris Wolf and founder of Trap Heart Books. Author of many books himself, one of which is called Occulture, the unseen forces that drive culture forward. And he joins me down the line from his home in Sweden. Carl, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's great to be here, and I look forward to this conversation.
Looking at your work, Carl, I started to wonder, is the occult, or has the occult been the hidden hand, the driving force behind all cultures since the dawn of time?
Yeah, it's as they say on the news nowadays, there's a lot to unpack there. Mainly, I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is, of course, that everything begins in the dark. Everything begins in the hidden, whether it's like metaphysical or spiritual or magical, meaning ideas all come from somewhere, whether it's the unconscious or a communication with other people. We have to, ping pong ideas and make them more conducive to a realistic manifestation. That's one way of looking at it, because the occult, of course, means hidden, something that's in the dark. But usually, as you know, when we talk about the occult, it's something having to do with metaphysical, magical, esoteric things that have been hidden throughout the decades, centuries, even millennia, for various reasons, usually that they have contradicted the main narrative or the discourse of the powers that be. So it's a kind of a secretive transmission of ideas that are usually developed to transform or better oneself. And there are many examples of that from basically every culture there is. One very common one that has gone hand in hand with what we call occultism is, for instance, Freemasonry in the Western sphere, where this kind of secret organization, a brotherhood, and you are gradually initiated into the mysteries. The mysteries could be many things, basically doing a kind of a symbolic journey to transform and improve yourself. Then that collaborative potential of working together with people who have gone through the same kinds of things, it's a strong bond, and it can create a platform or pressure cooker in a way for other things that seep into culture, seep into politics, seep into society in general. Of course, the occult as such, meaning kind of an experimental behavior of rituals, of meditations, they exist in each culture, but they take very different forms, of course. So I think, yes, to both these perspectives, it does change things. Maybe the technically or strictly hocus pocus aspects of it aren't clearly visible, but that's one of my main premises in my research and writing, is that it's gradually becoming more so. The occult is more and more and more out in the open, and that of course affects mainstream culture, and that has been going on for, I would say, maybe 100 years. This kind of audacious taking space, taking time, and a lot of people are lifting the lid of various pots and pans to see what's actually there. And I think it's a vast and big discussion. I think in general that this has to do with the fact that we need to look at life, culture, politics, economics, all kinds of human aspects, and see what can be changed in a healthier way. And I think that unconsciously or consciously or both, people are looking for new avenues instead of the rigid sort of binary perspectives that they have been brought up in via school or parents, whatever. So I think it's a high time for a new kind of experimentation, and high time. I think it's already going on. A lot of it is in pop culture, so it may seem diluted, commercialized, evanescent in a way, but I think in essence that doesn't matter. The mere presence of these deeper kinds of processes, even if they're commercialized, I think they fill a function, and I think they fill people with some kind of inspiration that is needed in these quite bleak times.
Well, that's a very interesting sort of introduction to our discussion. I think it's also quite abstract, Carl, and I'd like to kind of position it, if you like, in the here and now, in history itself. Now, you said it could be a vast discussion. I agree with you. Looking at your book, it's a vast subject. We could go back to the start of time and we'd be here for another 10 hours before we even got to the first millennium. But anyway, I'd like to focus, if possible, possibly in the period, the last 100 years, but more particularly sort of from the end of the Second World War, and how the occult played a part, as you say, not just in abstract philosophical discussions, but in economics and politics, and of course in popular culture, where it did seem to move more center stage. So let's start with, if you don't mind, a sort of overview, and I suppose we're talking about the Western world here, because as you said in your introduction, the occult is all cultures across the globe. But if we look at Western culture, Europe and the United States in particular, what was the kind of, how would you describe the occult influences that were permeating culture, Western culture at the end of the Second World War? What sort of influences were there?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at the Western Hemisphere, and that's mainly the sphere that was affected by the Second World War and the politics that happened just before, and the politics that also followed in the sense of the Cold War, etc., etc. It's a problematic time, and the more problematic something is, and the more violent something is, I like the symbol or the image of the pendulum. It's when it swings very extremely to one side, it will eventually swing extremely to the other side. And I think that's exactly what happened after the Second World War. And I think I posited in the book, I've certainly done it elsewhere, that there is, for instance, correlation or a relationship between the development of atomic energy that was kind of inevitably used for destructive purposes, and the discovery, I put this in quotes, the discovery or emergence of something so potent as psychedelics or LSD in particular. It's sort of, they went hand in hand and ushered in this new age of paranoia, control, the Cold War, escalation, and I think anxiety is a good word, hand in hand with something that is sort of liberating. And I'm thinking, of course, of how that psychedelic movement and a lot of Eastern influences came in and created what we could call maybe the hippie movement or the counterculture of the 1960s specifically. But there had also been the beatniks before that. So we're seeing how the pendulum gradually swings from total possible devastation. I had friends who lived already, who were adults in the 1960s and remembered like the Bay of Pigs and this sort of, oh my God, the world's going to end tomorrow. It was like, yeah, it's really paranoid and must have been horrible. But that was walking almost hand in hand or running parallel with these almost naive optimism and hope and Eastern meditation and yoga and psychedelics, basically a transcendence, right? It was called transcendental meditation or a transcendental lifestyle. So that's the pendulum swinging there. in the midst of that emergence, there was also re-emergence of occult figures from earlier in the century. And I'm thinking one very a key person was the British magician and poet, author, etc., Aleister Crowley, who formulated his own magical system. So it was technical. He meant it as some kind of schooling for people to go through in his orders, groups, so that they could refine themselves and adopt a kind of philosophy of will that I think in great part was a heritage from Nietzsche and Schopenhauer before that, but with some extra magic on top of it. And that was, of course, very attractive to these sort of turned on young people of the early 1960s and onwards. That's interesting in itself, but how it then seeped into culture proper was not so much what was going on then, because the pendulum then was swinging back and forth, perhaps specifically during the Vietnam War, and how the various fractions of American society clashed against each other. But what happened afterwards is more interesting, and that's when people got, in quotes again, sober from this great turn-on time, and started applying what they had learned into things that had to do with, let's call it external reality, ecological awareness, humane awareness, civil rights awareness, etc., etc. So this kind of consciousness that came from this quite explosive time of psychedelics and occult philosophy, and perhaps also occult practice, created ripple effects that we can still feel in society today, in the Western world, and probably elsewhere also. So that's one example how people like Crowley, also the Austrian Rudolf Steiner, who created the anthroposophical movement, many of his ideas and anthroposophy have greatly affected our societies, with Waldorf schools and caring for disabled people, and what we call it, biodynamic farming, many things. And there are other examples as well. And I think we are the inheritors, so we're living in a world today which, again, the pendulum seems to be going crazy for various reasons. But the legacy from that quite positive occult-infused pendulum swing we can still feel today. And I know that many people are working with it to take it even further, specifically perhaps in climate change approaches and civil rights and that kind of thing.
So, I mean, there's a lot in what you said there, Carl, and I want to kind of backtrack a little bit. I love the metaphor of the pendulum. I think that that's a very interesting way of exploring this, because one of the aspects of that pendulum was post the Second World War, a kind of lack of belief, a lack of faith, not just in organized religion, which definitely had a sort of downturn in the post-war years, but also a sort of lack of belief in a lot of the things that people had invested in, such as nationality, nationhood, politics even of one sort or another, that somehow these would solve society's problems. I suppose my question is, was the occult a kind of reaction, or partly a reaction against that, a seeking not just of something different, but something radically alternative to how Western society had been ordered up until then?
Mm-hmm. I think the occult, as we talk about it now, meaning core of philosophy and experiential practices, esoteric bonds, etc. I think that's almost been like a constant in human culture. Again, I would add in the Western sphere, meaning people have always worked with these things, from medieval alchemists or black magicians to Neoplatonic philosophers during the Renaissance, and further back, all the way back to shamanic times. This way of acting and thinking and relating to reality, meaning it has some kind of transcendental potential at least, has always been there. So what I think changed was that there was a an emergence of an interest or a need, we should perhaps call it, when things were going completely gaga. We could take another other example from art history. After the First World War, or actually coinciding with it, was the Dada movement, which sort of shattered art in a way and then reassembled the pieces into a kind of collage mentality, basically saying that nothing is as it seems, everything can be blown up, there's no guarantee of safety or order, or impressionism or natural vistas, or paintings like Sargent of pastoral things. It's just explosive. And then surrealism came. Many of the surrealists were esoterically inclined, and they added a sense of, I guess, humor, dream language, also coinciding with another inner movement, which was psychoanalysis, that sort of came on really strongly during the first half of the 20th century. So I think we're seeing or saw then like an inner striving to see what's inside, because the outside is simply too crazy, too violent, too deranged, and see if we can find some ways of improving. And I think that was the case. And I think the epitome of the 20th century was the 1960s, because there were simply so many things. And again, like you mentioned, also kind of dissolving of perhaps not national borders, but national identities. You could have an Indian guru or a voodoo teacher. There was a kind of, a dissolution there, because the rules that had been adhered to or obeyed were seen, I think, as kind of pointless. So in that sense, not so much that the occult became stronger, but people allowed it to become more manifest. Maybe it was an empowering saying, I believe in this and this, or I am a Freemason, or I'm a magician in the tradition of Aleister Crowley, that there was no shame or need to hide that anymore. It became more out in the open. And that's a movement that I have called occulturation. There's another term in anthropology called acculturation, which means that a set of behavior and thoughts move into another culture. But the occulturation, what I mean by that is exactly that. What has been hidden, whether it's philosophy, magical practices, religious secret practices, they go into the visible. It's that simple. It's like the analogy of the seed and the flower. The seed grows in the dark, and it cannot be a flower that we can enjoy in the sunlight unless it's allowed to germinate in the dark, then pierce the crust or the surface, and then go towards being beautiful. And I think that image is also quite relevant to the times that we're in, actually. I think there's a lot of gardening going on right now, where a lot of flowers are coming up. They may seem chaotic, like a wild garden or a lush garden, but those flowers are needed to pollinate, not just via bees, but humans in general.
Now, you touched on something there which we have covered quite extensively on this channel, and that is the 1960s as a kind of touchstone. And in some ways, we're still living through the aftermath of everything that happened in the 1960s. One of the questions I've asked a number of contributors, and I'd be very interested in your views on this, Carl, is how the occult, and when we talk about the occult, I'm talking about esoteric practices and the philosophical, magical elements that you've identified, how they gripped popular culture. So, for example, if we look at the figure of Aleister Crowley, he'd been dead 20 years, well, almost 20 years by the time the 60s started. He was relatively obscure by the time he died. His notoriety had been at the earlier part of the 20th century. However, by the 1960s, we have a lot of very prominent popular entertainment figures who subscribe to him and his philosophy as a kind of guiding light. And it seems to come out of nowhere. What's your take on that, as to how he in particular, how his philosophy, his thinking, how it began to permeate that culture at that time? I mean, what was going on, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think in his case, it's quite clear. Like during his lifetime, he was branded as the the wickedest man in the world, and he was quite unashamed or unabashed. He was using drugs and experimental sexualities and creating little orders and basically a new kind of cultic religious movement with him as the prophet, of course. But anyway, so he was a bad boy of not only British poetry and literature, but also in general of British culture. And when he died, he fell into not forgetfulness, but I guess he was forgotten for a while. But then, of course, the Beatles used him on the cover in that beautiful collage of Sgt. Pepper album, the sort of classic psychedelic album of the era. So, of course, that's a rebranding, saying we adopt you as a precursor or a source of inspiration, just like all the other people on that cover. So that's one thing. And you mentioned also musicians. I'm thinking specifically of Jimmy Page, who had been in the Yardbirds, had financial success, and then started Led Zeppelin, a band that went on to claim, enormous fortunes and a great deal of success. And he was always very clear about his interest in Aleister Crowley and the philosophy and the magical system. And he had the funds also via his musical income to buy up a lot of first editions and art and Crowley manuscripts. So he was really basking in that thing. And here's the thing, you can do that in the occult sense. You can hoard, you can use it in your own little magical temple chamber, or you could be vocal about it. And Page was vocal about it, saying, this has inspired me. He even bought Crowley's lodge or a manor in a way up in Scotland, called Boleskine, and lived there and wrote a lot of music there. And that was out there in the media. And another example, more from the underground, was the American filmmaker Kenneth Anger, who was a devout follower. He never met Crowley, but was a follower from early on and used Crowley's imagery, symbolism in his underground films that were basically the part of the cinematic fodder of the turned on generation in California and beyond. So there were like active, I would call it seed sowing in a way, from artists who were vocal, who had no need to or desire to be silent about their own esoteric interests. And I think that kind of presence via proxy, other people talking about you, that's probably the best kind of PR you can get, especially if they're cool rock stars or cool underground filmmakers. And those things leave a ripple effect. And that's still today. And the difference is, of course, also when there is a slight interest in the general market, there will be publishers, there will be record companies to re-release that stuff. So during the 60s and particularly the 70s, there was some seminal Crowley books being republished again in a kind of scholarly way, in a scholarly format, that also helped usher in this new interest of Crowley.
I mean, if we just stick with Jimmy Page, who I think is a very interesting figure in this. I mean, he was a sort of very much in the mid-60s with the Yardbirds and a legendary session player and all the rest of it. And as you say, Led Zeppelin started, 68, 69, and very quickly became identified, or his work became identified with Crowley and all of that. And as you say, he was very explicit about it and the philosophy, which obviously propagated it, made it very fashionable, as Led Zeppelin were the most popular band on the planet, certainly in the early 70s. But again, the question, I suppose, and he's a good example to ask this for, this is a man who grew up in suburban London, very much got into the blues like a lot of his generation, via rockabilly and various other musical forms, and was very into his music. It's quite a leap to go from playing the blues and being a good session guitarist to having a real, quite devoted interest in something so esoteric as Aleister Crowley. And again, I asked the question, Carl, I mean, in your researches and your thought, What was the thing? Was it something which was just fashionable that he and others would latch on to, or was it something that kind of represented a very marked break with what had been before?
Yeah, this will be like conjecture or speculation on my side, but I think in Page's case, I think he has been serious all along, not just someone with money who could collect cool things. Um, but I think he's been a serious practitioner. Ergo, the success of Led Zeppelin. I'm not saying that's pure evidence, but it proves to me that he was doing something right, or that they were doing something right. Anger was also very serious and worked the system and really spread Crowley around in a way. He never got financially successful, but that may not be the end all or be all. He was very successful as an artist, and that's proof enough for me. I think we could compare it with the Crowley's portrait on the Sgt. Pepper album, which of course may have been affected by the Beatles themselves, but it was done by this pop artist. I forgot his name, not Richard Hamilton. Anyway, Mayan artist who put these faces together, obviously condoned and supported by the Beatles. So I think at that point, which was, as you said, 20 years ago, that Crowley, he died in 47 and this was in 1967, and there's even that phrase in one of the songs, right? It was 20 years ago today. But then we become conspiratorial. Then we try to find things that might or might not be there in reality. So I think from their point of view, it was just a kind of a psychedelic celebration of quote unquote cool people who had inspired them in some way. I think maybe George Harrison was the only one who was like a spiritual seeker. The other ones I don't see as they were more like people who loved music and became successful and very good at it. But George Harrison obviously had some kind of spiritual thing going on. And I don't think he was interested in Crowley. I think Crowley popped up there via that cover and the fact that he was still a controversial British person that gradually spread outside the cultural borders of the UK, and then basically had another resurgence in the 70s in the US with books published and kind of a reorganization of Crowley's magical order, something that is still going on today. So all it needs is a few good seed and gardeners tending the flowers, and then it can grow to become forest.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've sort of made me think. I mean, you had Sgt. Pepper's in 1967. You also had their Satanic Majesty's Request, which is the
Yes.
Rolling Stones album, which seemed to have a slightly darker vibe. And then if we look at the Rolling Stones through 68 with Sympathy for the Devil, etc., and then 69, we have the death of Brian Jones, Altamont, lots of sort of occult stuff swirling around the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones seem to check out at that point. You know, they've had enough of that vibe. And then Led Zeppelin come in and take it up. I mean, I suppose I'm wondering, Carl, would you suggest that popular music, in particular from the 1960s anyway, became a kind of portal for whatever these unseen forces, which is at the key of your thesis around occulture? Would you see that these unseen forces sort of permeate in these lives of these musicians, these famous people, and somehow present themselves, manifest themselves through their music, but also through the impact of their music on other people?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I call the occulturation process, because I think it was Ezra Pound or someone wrote that artists are the antennae of the race, meaning that artists are sensitive, sometimes hypersensitive. They are pragmatic in their creating their own bouquets of inspiration, and that fertilizes whatever is going on in their minds. We have to keep in mind also that this was a very loose decade, and I don't mean only sexually, but also in terms of metabolic challenges. There were a lot of drugs around, and the stardom and the money and the fame that can, of course, create people who are not necessarily living in objective reality. So that can be quite conducive to being affected or inspired by perhaps not only transcendence but also transgression in a way, like crossing borders that shouldn't maybe be crossed. And then I think the occult lore of history is quite attractive. And Kenneth Anger, that I mentioned, he hung out with the Rolling Stones, for instance, so he was maybe more on their side than on the Beatles side of things. And he certainly brought in Crowley wherever he went. He was like a Crowley beacon in a way. And I think that although Sympathy for the Devil, I think, probably has more to do with the Master and Margarita, at least if we can trust Mick Jagger. Bulgakov's beautiful novel, which is a satire over the downfall of the Soviet Union in a way, or tyrannical governments in general, and that kind of hypocrisy. Yet Crowley was, of course, known to them. So I'm not saying he was like the key instigator of that song or anything. It was all in the zeitgeist. And I think it was fueled by controversy, by being rebellious, which is also kind of an occult classic thing, an outcast, but an outcast who can afford good lawyers if things go overboard in a way. So you can be a rebel if you can afford it. And I think that's true for many of these people. So yeah, and I think that's how it has moved, whether it's anthroposophy or Crowley's Thelema philosophy or some kind of American Satanism. It always comes into the main culture via people who adopt and adapt to, become sort of inadvertent salesmen or beacons, like I said, of a philosophy or a magical system. And that goes for wider things as well, like Maharishi, again, George Harrison and the Beatles brought in that kind of thing. And I mean, transcendental meditation is huge. It's a huge business. Even David Lynch became a beacon or a spokesperson for transcendental meditation up until his death recently.
Yes, I mean, you're making me think just as you're talking there, Carl, about that, because you said something I just want to pick up before I completely forget it, and it's in relation to Led Zeppelin, and they had phenomenal success for at least 12 years until the death of John Bonham, and you said perhaps it was maybe because of Jimmy Page's dalliances with esoteric writings and that sort of thing. I mean, how does that work? How would you suggest that that sort of mindset, that sort of thinking, that sort of philosophy, how does that manifest itself as success, or how is it a driver for success in something like rock music?
I think it can work in many different ways, maybe perhaps in two main ways. One is that the person in question gets so infatuated with the philosophy or the magical system, the occult system, that he or she wants to go through it. Meaning, if there are degrees of initiation or some kind of curriculum, you do that and you feel that you are becoming refined as that kind of magician. I think that's probably happening a lot, but to a lesser degree than number two, which is, I think, general inspiration, meaning that as a scenario, as a young musician in the 1960s, you discover Aleister Crowley and you become so inspired by his rebelliousness, his sort of bad boy attitude, like the Oscar Wilde of the dark side, and you become sort of enamored with that spirit, and that fills you with your own creative spirit. I mean, by proxy, and that's not hocus pocus. That's just pure psychology, because we all know that there have been people in our family or at school or in later life, people that have inspired us to the point of us becoming more of ourselves than we were before. And it's not someone dogmatically telling you, as in a system, that now you have to do this ritual or now you have to do this meditation. It's just by flow or proxy where you are inspired. And I think that's much more common, that people can, if you pardon the expression, they can get off on someone's life, someone's creativity, someone's attempts at seeking higher levels of consciousness, whatever it is. And that can be quite enough for people as fuel fuel for their own engine on their own path in a way. Whereas the more technical, in a way, scholarly, initiatory path, I think that's for fewer people. Those people exist, of course, but I'm not sure that that's a more valid route than the one being filled with inspiration from this magician or this artist or this filmmaker. I think I have been on both sides of these things, and I think that the inspiration fills me with more joy than the strictly initiatory path, which is more like going to school.
In your brief run through on some of the influences of the 20th century, you named a number of people who, for want of a better expression, are part of the psychological world rather than the occult, or certainly that's their preeminent place in society. I'm thinking of people like Jung, people like Freud. And just as we're talking about success, you will know that some of the more New Age elements in recent years have talked about manifestation, that you can imagine whatever it is you want and it will become a reality. I'm beginning to wonder how much of, in your experience, in your research, when it comes to occult and occulturation, how much of that is a psychological phenomena and how much of it is a supernatural one?
Brilliant question, one that's been on my mind for years now. I started out, I was very much a believer, or someone with the mind frame that, it's there are things out there, forces out there, but of course there are, like sunshine and wind and telluric energies and whatever, absolutely. But I used to believe also in that, you call up this force in some kind of liturgy stemming from medieval times, and that will have an effect. But as I moved along in sort of my own magical research and development, I was, I would say that I have turned not 100%, but very much onto the psychological side, meaning that I believe that whatever sphere of residence for these forces, I would say it's our unconscious. I would say that I'm Freudian. I'm very much more a Jungian in a way. I think Freud was great in disseminating the light bulb. You could see, you switch it on and you see how it works. But Jung turned his head upward in a way and looked at the sun, because the sun affects everything. And I think that's a valid point when you look at esoteric or occult things. Because you can't argue with someone who says, I called on this angel or I call on this demon to do my bidding. If it works for them, that's wonderful, whatever floats the boat. But I think that the mechanics involved that makes things happen is basically psychological. You can then call it like a programming. When I say these liturgical, romantic sounding names from occult lore, is it actually happening, or is it me kind of meta programming myself by using words that are traditional or forbidden or powerful in their vibration? I think, I don't know, but I would say that I think Jung was right in many things. For instance, that I've tied in with my occulturation theory, is that before things go awry, before things crash, before we all go to the extinction, whatever it's called, let's try to find some kind of collective conscious and collective unconscious, to see what can be improved. See how we can deal with things instead of being the same kind of ant-heap creatures fighting it out in endless, pointless wars and stagnation and inertia. And I think Jung was right in saying that there is a collective unconscious. That's why we have similar kinds of symbols, for instance, emerging in different cultures. And I believe that the reason why there is so much occulturation, again, meaning the occult coming up to visible spheres, there's a reason for that. It's that we have to change gear. We have to change direction, and staying in the same grooves will not do us any good. So it's high time to think of new perspectives. And I think that what has been hidden in the sense of radical theories, radical spiritual things, radical whatever, needs to surface now in order for us to address, assess, and implement.
I've got a final question for you, Carl, because we could talk for hours on this. Unfortunately, we haven't got hours. We've talked about the occult as a loose collection of ideas and thoughts and philosophies which coalesce around the word occult and popular culture. We talked about how that permeated music in particular in the 1960s onwards. And then we talked about the sort of psychological elements to it, which also had a linkage, a nexus, if you like, with the occult, the emergence of the occult in the early 20th century. So sometimes with people, when they talk about the occult in the New Age, they turn it into something which is a philosophical debate, really. It's something which is as a way of looking at life here and now. And they kind of play down any kind of supernatural element. And I suppose my question, Carl, is that if you look at Aleister Crowley, who's a central figure to our discussion here and the influences, Crowley was very much a self-confessed black magician, Satanist. How much, if at all, does Satan, the devil, as we would say, how much does that actually play a part in this occult revival, in this occult hidden hand?
That's a great question. I think that we all need symbols to get triggered. And get triggered, I mean, in a positive way, like we get inspired by certain kinds of art, certain kinds of music, certain kinds of cultural phenomena, which might not be our own. They could be exotic, whatever. And I think that when we're young, we're all looking for something to see where our own limits are. How far can we go with this before I hit a brick wall, or mommy and daddy get angry? That's part of the growing up and individuation in general. So I think when we look at the process of, let's call it self-improvement, and then add things of a controversial nature, like controversial names or controversial phenomena, then of course it taints that process, but it can also help that process, because the attraction is the key. Why are we attracted to the devil? Why are we attracted to Loki? Why are we attracted to any other sort of dark side or demonic part of the pantheon or the cultural pantheon? I think there's a reason for that. Not everyone wants to, submit and say yay and amen to everything that's presented to you. When you're young, you are inherently rebellious, and you should be. And you need to see what you're really about. And sometimes you have to go on what certain indigenous cultures call like a vision quest. You have to find out for yourself who you are and what you want to do with your life. That's the essence of Crowley's philosophy as well. And if we use symbols that other people find distasteful or horrifying, whatever, that's just part of our own individuation process. That applies on a cultural level too. The reason why that symbol even exists, now I'm talking about the devil or Satan or whatever you want to call it, the reason that exists is because it's been convenient as something to hold up to frighten people who are easily frightened. I think it's that simple. Then, of course, we can talk about a Jungian concept of the shadow or the dark side. Of course, you have to confront that. You can't become a whole, full, total human being without confronting your own darker side. That's just common sense. And I think that in itself has taken on various, perhaps subcultural forms that are appealing to teenagers, basically.
Carl, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together. Tell people where they can find out more about you and the various works that you've written, and also your website.
Right, exactly. I think I have carlabrahamsson.com, Carl with a C, Abrahamsson with two S's, so carlabrahamsson.com. And I also have a link tree, which is great because it has all of my upcoming classes and all the websites. It's linktr.ee /Carl Abrahamsson. And I think there people will find all the relevant stuff. And I'm very easy to talk to. I welcome communication. and I love being in touch with people in general. And of course, as you know, I'm enamored by all these topics, so I'm very, very happy to be in touch.
Well, we'd be very happy to have you here on Things Visible and Invisible. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.